It's game time.
What's up, Internet? I'm here talking about some DLC. Now, for those who don't know what this is, downloadable content, or DLC, is content that you download. Makes sense. It's a digital add-on to expand a game. Now, because there are so many different types of DLC and different distribution methods, and a new one seems to pop up every other day now, I'm really just going to cherry pick a few of the more prominent ones, and worst case scenario, this can just be a jumping off point for a later video down the line if I feel one needs to be made. So let's get into this. So let's start with the big one, expansion packs. Now, depending on where you trace back their roots from, expansion packs either came from episodic gaming, and this will be a topic for another video down the line. The earliest instance of episodic gaming that I can think of is the Sword Quest games on the Atari 2600. If you see it as a simple expansion of a pre-existing game, then the earliest consoleized example I could think of is Sonic 3, where you had to physically connect two separate cartridges to get the full experience of the game. But it can also be tracked back further to stuff like Doom, with the whole fan-made campaigns and what have you. Either way, functionally speaking, I think all around this is probably the best kind of downloadable content. Essentially, for a minimum fee of $10, $15, what have you, you get an extra several hours of gameplay, be it an extra campaign for a game, or just some bonus missions, extra maps for multiplayer, whatever. For developers, they don't generally have to spend a whole lot of time creating a bunch of new assets, as it's usually just pre-existing assets presented in a different way. So it doesn't take a ton of money or manpower to design comparatively to at least a whole new game. And it's a good investment for developers because they know it'll sell. Because fans of games that do this, such as Fallout or Assassin's Creed, Mass Effect, what have you, if we're fans of these games, chances are we're gonna buy it because we love this game, and for an extra $10 we can go and get an extra, 5-10 hour campaign out of it. That's awesome. We're gonna do it, obviously, because we love the game and we're just spending a little bit more to get a lot more out of it. But as nice as this form of DLC is, there is one or two problems with it. First of all is obviously value. Now this is debatable, but I've heard the argument from some people that certain expansion packs weren't worth the money they were paid. And that's really relative to the individual. But the one big issue that I can argue that seems like a constant is how the expansion pack is accessed. And what I mean by this is an expansion pack should not be accessed within the confines of a story. Two of the biggest names I can think of, which I've already named as to why, are Mass Effect and Assassin's Creed. Mass Effect 2 ended on a DLC which led into Mass Effect 3. If you didn't pay for this DLC and you didn't play it, then the story kind of jumps around a little bit. And Assassin's Creed had a pretty bad one with Assassin's Creed 2, where down the lines of the story, there were two side-by-side chapters in the middle that were just glanced over. It was acknowledged in the game that you just couldn't access these two chapters and just skipped past it. And that's just terrible for your customer, because it makes them feel like they were cheated. Simply because it feels like the thing that they purchased is not wholly available to them. So even if this DLC was produced afterwards, the fact that it bars them out of what is kind of the main story of the entire thing, it just feels like we're being cheated. And that really hurts the people who are invested in the story who maybe can't afford it. So that's terrible, and I will be coming back to this later near the end with something else. But let's move on to the second type of DLC. You have cosmetic stuff. For example, like a skin for a gun in Call of Duty, or a different color scheme for your characters in Street Fighter, or whatever. These sit in a little bit of a weird place for me. Functionally, I like these, because if someone's passionate enough about a game that they want to go out and spend an extra $2, $3 to make their character, relatively speaking, a little more unique to them, good for them. It's something they paid for, it's something they own, and it allows them to feel special, which might in turn make them spend more time in the game. Good for them. The biggest problem I have with this, though, and maybe this is just me showing my age here, But stuff like extra costumes and stuff like extra colors for characters in fighting games and whatever, before DLC was really a readily available thing, a lot of this stuff was just included in games. Like, just for free. Already there, just as a bonus. Now, again, maybe this just shows my age, but from the perspective of someone who has lived in the day and age where bonus features were included in games, this feels like they just chopped off a bit of extra content to try and nickel and dime you. And while I understand this isn't actually the case, it does certainly feel like that for some people who are aware of games that did allow extra costumes and stuff without having to pay extra money. But again, it's there for the people who want it. If you don't want it, don't buy it. No problems. The third type of content I want to talk about is the armaments. Now, depending on what kind of game you are playing, this means a few different things. But it's like having a different playable character or an extra weapon in whatever game. To develop these well, it's a little bit trickier, because you have to take into account balance. If it's a single player game, you don't want the player to just be able to run through the game nuking everything without any real challenge. But at the same time, you don't want the content that they paid for to feel completely worthless and a waste of money. So it really is tough to develop for. I think the best way to do this for a single player game is to present a weapon or character that allows the player to have a different experience without completely destroying the balance. Now, this is really tricky, but doing something well never is easy. However, this becomes a colossal problem in online multiplayer games, and you really have to account for balance in here. If someone has an extra character or weapon that just makes them flat out better than people who won't pay money for a game, on top of what they've already paid anyway, it's just not going to be fun to play. And that ultimately hurts the longevity of any game, which in turn hurts sales, which hurts developers in the end. So you really do have to take into consideration balance. And for games that expand your roster by paying extra money, I flat out can't stand that. I think the best example I can give, and this is actually probably a terrible example because it's kind of in a weird place, but is Killer Instinct on the Xbox One. It's a free game that gives you one character to play as, and it rotates out, I think, every month and a half or so. If you were to play this game and not pay any extra money, you'd have one character. And I'm going to assume you're a fighting game fan here or something, because you're playing a fighting game. Why wouldn't you want to play it online competitively? That's mostly how fighting games are played. If you were to fight me online and I just happen to chuck out, what is it now, $80 for the full roster? Jeez. You are going to be strategically at a disadvantage because you have your one character, which I'll already know what it is because everyone knows what the free character is, and I'll be able to pick a character that might be strategically better against X character. You'll still probably beat me because I'm the worst fighting game player ever, but it gives me a serious advantage over you. And that's the functional problem of offering this system of purchasing characters to fill out a roster. It means that someone who's willing to put in extra money, who might just have a little bit more expendable income, is going to be infinitely more prone to winning simply because they have a strategic advantage over everyone else, who might not be able to afford it. But again, this is kind of a terrible example simply because it's a free game. I'm not sure if that redeems it, but it's kind of in a weird place with me. I think it's important that if it's going to affect multiplayer, it has to be available for everyone, even if it requires hours of grinding to unlock. People will end up paying for this because they feel that their time is more valuable than their money, and for those who simply can't afford it, they aren't left on a completely unbalanced playing field. I wasn't initially going to talk about this next one simply because there isn't a ton of examples to give, but it is something that I would like to talk about a little bit, so just consider this a fun little bonus feature, and that's Expand Alone DLC. And I'm not sure if that's an official term or something I made up. Whatever, let's use it. Essentially what this is sort of like an expansion pack, but it plays on its own without the game that it's expanding off of. It also might use the assets in a different manner. My best example would be Far Cry 3 Blood Dragon. Now what's great about this type of DLC is people who might be off of the main game's development because their portion of contributing might be done, they can still work on some content to produce something neat that might appeal to people. If someone's a fan of the game, it allows them to buy like an expansion pack. They'll have to run it on its own without any connection to the main game, but it's still more of the same basic game. But for people who might not necessarily be certain if they want to play this game or not, they can pay a small fee to get a taste of the game. And it's its own standalone thing, it's its own complete story, so you don't have to worry about loose ends or whatever. This does get a little bit dangerously close to paying for a demo, but usually in the examples that I've seen, it's taking content that was created for a main game to create a fun little side story that was repurposed slightly so it was cheaper for developers, which is great, and then just released to the public. And for people who might not necessarily be interested in the main game, because it's presented in a different way, it might garner attention from new fans who might not have wanted to play the main game or may have even hated the main game. I mean, again, looking at Far Cry 3 and Far Cry 3 Blood Dragon, I couldn't really stand Far Cry 3. It was functionally fine, but I felt it was boring. But Far Cry 3 Blood Dragon was just an 80s sci-fi cheese fest, and I was so in on that just because it appealed to me, which is great. I think that's kind of the entire point of that, is smaller games using bigger games' assets at a reduced cost to appeal to a bigger crowd, because it's appealing to a completely different crowd than the main game. And the people who enjoy this, even though they might not enjoy the main game, they might get invested in the mechanics and in turn go to the main game. So, while there's not a ton to talk about, because I can only off the top of my head think of maybe 2 or 3 with like Dead Rising 2 and Infamous 2 as well. I think it's a cool concept, and I hope that developers continue on this road, but try and stay as far away from that whole paid demo thing as possible, because that's terrible. Alright, now that I've talked about a few prominent DLCs, and the good they can provide for the game industry and the gamers as a whole, I want to talk about a few bad DLC practices. So, let's just start with the colossal elephant in the room and go with on-disc DLC. Now, for those out there who don't know what on-disc DLC is, the term might sound really cool. You know, you've got a disc, it's got DLC on it. Awesome. Well, not quite. And I'm gonna have to reiterate this a few times just to make sure the point sinks in, but essentially, you go out, you purchase a disc, you take it home, you pop it in your machine, you're getting ready to play it and have a grand old time, except that you can't access all the content because the developers feel that you haven't paid enough money to unlock everything on the game. Now, this is primarily used to combat used game sales because game developers don't make any money off that. But again, it's kinda skeevy because again, you went out, you purchased a game, you legally own this thing, you spent your own hard-earned money on this thing, it's 100% yours. Any country with legal ownership laws will say that this is yours. You take it home, you want to enjoy it, but you can't access things on the disc you paid because you haven't paid enough directly to the people who made it. And this is a practice that absolutely needs to stop. I understand that game developers want to fight used game sales as much as they can, and developers can argue that on-disc DLC makes sense because it's stored there for convenience. You know, it saves on download time later. What's going to be faster, a 2-second download of a quick 200-byte key that'll unlock it, or a 5-gigabyte file? No question, one is faster than the other. And yeah, you could argue that half the on-disc DLC might not be completed at launch. As much as you want to argue this, and have validity to your points, I won't argue that. To your customer, you're still always going to feel like you're screwing them over. And because they're your customer, and you kind of rely on them to purchase your product in order to continue to have a job, it's not wise to go out of your way to piss them off. So, my only real advice here is, if it's not complete and not intended for your consumer at launch, don't put it on the disc. Because from what I've noticed, people are willing to put up with lengthy download times over feeling like the people they're trying to support are stealing from them. But ultimately, you're hurting your customers by doing this, because you're kind of turning them away from your own product in a way because they feel cheated. And this goes back to the Assassin's Creed 2 argument, is that I own this thing. Why can't I access the thing that I own? It just feels like the person who worked hard to earn the money and purchase it is getting completely cheated out of the thing that they bought and worked hard to buy. But just keep an eye out for this, and try to avoid supporting it whenever possible because it's a terrible practice. Unlike on-disc DLC, the next practice I want to talk about isn't as ambiguously bad, but more or less a sticking point for me. And that's DLC released simultaneously with the purchase of a game. If I purchase a game and I throw it in my PS3 or whatever, and I go to the PS3 store and I see like 10, 20 different DLCs already available, that makes me mad. And this might entirely be personal to me, and I recognize this, but if developers are working in tandem to produce DLC with the game so that the game has DLC at launch, and maybe this is just optimistic of me saying this, but that should functionally be on the disc. Because any content that's produced prior to the disc being readily available to the public should be available to the public on the disc they paid for when it's available at whatever later date when the game gets made. And the reason for this is simple. It feels like developers are sectioning off their teams to work on various DLCs whereas other teams are still working on the production of the disc. And yes, I understand certain teams don't work on production all the way through from beginning to end. I get that, I really do. But it does feel pretty skeevy to purchase a brand new thing day one only to find that new content has already been created and was actually out prior to the game launching, and I have to pay for it if I want the full game experience. Because again, if you purchase a game brand new at launch, it just feels odd that you wouldn't have the entire gaming experience that's available to you at that point. Because, you know, you're a day one customer, you paid the money. I don't know, that might just be entirely my problem, but it's something that I think is a really poor practice. And it hurts the consumer because we, the consumers, wish to buy this product. If we don't get the best product we can that's available to us, again, we feel cheated. Or at least I do. I don't know about the rest of you, but that's me. Alright, the final practice I want to talk about is something that, this is going to go by really quick. It's just going to be a quick little acknowledgement because it's a whole video on its own, but microtransactions. Stop doing this. Okay, acknowledged. Seriously, it's a terrible practice, and it's just buying power in a lot of games. It's unbalanced, and it can really wreck the difficulty of games. Also, it feels like developers are just leeching off customers at that point. Anyway, it's been acknowledged. I'll talk about it some later date, but to wrap this all up, what we can do is quite simple as consumers. If we have a game that we like, and we see downloadable content that we want and that we want to support, we buy it. If we see microtransactions, if we see on-disc DLC stuff, if we see, at least in my case, DLC that's available before and during launch, don't buy that. Just don't. Because ultimately, the gamer, the consumer, the customer is the one that pays the developer's way. It's your money that allows them to continue to do what they do best. And if they don't end up making money, then they're going to realize this and they're going to swap out their tactics and try different approaches to try and make your money back. That's just how business works. That's why they hire marketing departments, to make sure that their tactics are working and that they are making your money. So ultimately, if there's a game you want to support, if there's DLC you want to support, and you can, you know, support them. Send them your money. Buy their DLC. Enjoy their game. That's why it's there. DLC has the ability to make games infinitely better if we support it. But it also has the ability to also hurt the experience and the main product if DLC is misused, as people have seen in the past. So it's really up to us to keep the balance on this. But that was an incredibly brief look at some forms of DLC. There's a lot more out there that I haven't talked about yet, and I might at some later point. But I hope you found this informative, or at least entertaining, or useful, or something. But we'll see you next time.